This happened back whenever I was 6 years old, and while I can't remember every detail, I can remember most of what happened. It was in the autumn, right around Halloween. I live near a local amusement park that had this fun Halloween event that they would do every year, and there were basically two levels to it. The adult event, which was actually a big haunted house, and the kid event, which was this cute little spooky thing for little kids. I was an only kid, so I think my parents wanted to do everything to give me a great childhood. And they did. This wasn't a shot at them at all. I just wanted to explain that they did a lot to do things with me when I was really young. We went to the amusement park every year for several years, and it was a really fun time. Minus the aforementioned year when I was 6. My love for the macabre started back then, actually. I have always loved the spookiness of the season, and I can thank my mom for that. I think that's why they took me to the Halloween events at that park every year. It was good memories, but she also loved it. And she wanted to mold me into loving the spooky season too. The whole park was completely transformed into a Halloween funland. Hay bales, scarecrows, plastic skeletons hung up all over the place. In all the photos, it looks super cheesy, but for a 6-year-old, it was magical. Like stepping into another world. One of the main things I remember is that the park always smelled like caramel popcorn. I don't know why I remember that specifically, but it's one of my core memories of the place. Sorry, I know that was a bit long-winded. I don't mean to stretch this out too much. I'm just a bit nostalgic. My 6th year alive was, if I remember correctly based on the pictures my parents still have, the 3rd year that we had been going to the park. And in spite of what happened, it was not the last time. At one point during the afternoon, I remember telling my parents that I was feeling hungry and that I wanted caramel corn. My mom mentioned that she had to go to the restroom and told my dad to take me to the popcorn vendor to get some caramel popcorn, and that she would meet us back at the tables. My dad and I walked over to the vendor, and he was getting the popcorn together to purchase, getting the money out and whatnot. At that point, I was just standing there waiting, and I got very distracted by, of all things, a balloon cart. I remember that I saw a balloon at the cart that was shaped like a bat, and I wanted it, so I shuffled my little kid feet over to the cart to look at it. I was just standing there staring at the balloon when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I immediately thought it was my dad and said, "Dad, can we get that balloon?" and looked up. As soon as my eyes met with the eyes that were over me, I realized that it was not my dad. It was just some random guy. As soon as our eyes met, this man smiled and said, "Of course, honey," and then handed the man at the balloon cart some cash, and grabbed the balloon, and then handed the string to me. I grabbed it hesitantly and just stared at this man. He sort of pushed me along slightly, getting me a few steps ahead of the cart. I watched as he pulled a cell phone out of his pocket. It was one of those old Nokias, if I recall. You know the type. And he started pushing the buttons on it, but kept his other hand on my shoulder. My little 6-year-old brain was starting to ring alarm bells. Something was off. I remembered my mom telling me things like, "Don't walk away with strangers" and all that, but I was also a bit frozen in confusion, as this man had just bought me this balloon, and he had a grip on my shoulder. I said something like, "I gotta go find my dad." The man glanced down at me from his phone and gave me a big grin and then said, "Oh, that's okay. I know your dad. He's out in the parking lot. Come on, let's go find him." Even at that age, I knew that something was really off. My dad would not be in the parking lot. He would be at the popcorn stand, as that's where I saw him last. I wasn't that far from the stand, but for some dumb reason, my little brain wasn't even looking for him. I was just staring at this guy and probably thinking, what is this guy doing? Why is he doing this? As I thought this, he started pushing me a bit harder, getting me to walk forward. And for whatever reason, I kept walking. I was scared, obviously, and I did not want to go with him. I think that I was just having a panic attack at that age, and I didn't know what else to do. Then I did what was probably the smartest thing I have literally ever done. We were walking, him behind me with his hand on my shoulder, and I spotted a person dressed in a clown costume. He was standing there waving at random people, and at one point we made eye contact. As soon as we did, I shouted, "I can't find my dad! Help me find my dad!" As soon as I shouted this, the clown stopped his act and stood up straight. I'm pretty sure that he was staring at the man that was pushing me. As soon as I yelled this and caught the clown's attention, the man let go of my shoulder and just kept walking right past me, as if he hadn't had anything to do with me. Like, he wasn't just pushing me towards the front gate. The clown shouted, trying to get people's attention and trying to get the attention of security, I would guess, saying, "Hey, stop that man. The man with the blue baseball cap, green t-shirt. Somebody stop him." He then knelt down toward me and asked me if that man was my dad. I shook my head no and told him that he said he was going to take me to my dad and that I didn't know him. I remember the look on his face. He may have been dressed like a clown, but he looked horrified. He grabbed my hand and asked me if I was okay, asked me my name, and then asked if that man had hurt me in any way. I told him that he didn't hurt me and that I just wanted to find my dad. He nodded, and he asked me where I'd last seen him. I told him that we were getting popcorn, and he told me to come with him, and that he would find my dad. Interestingly, looking back, this was nearly the same situation as the other man, but the whole vibe was different. I trusted the clown, and I knew he wasn't going to hurt me. He led me over to the popcorn stand, and he asked me if I saw my dad. I looked around and told him I didn't, and he asked the vendor to call for security and have them make an announcement that I was waiting at the popcorn stand for my dad. After a few moments, I did see my dad, and I told him. He immediately waved to my parents, and they ran over. I remember both of them looking as exasperated as I was feeling. My mom ran over and hugged me. My dad started thanking the clown for finding me, and I remember him telling my dad about the other man, and mentioning that he had gotten a good look at him and that they were going to do a sweep to see if they could find him. I don't know if they ever did find him, though. I just remember that my parents were extra clingy, and they gave me a stern talking to about the whole thing. We didn't get to spend much more time there that day, though, and I didn't get to ride any of the rides, and I was pretty upset, but at the same time, I knew that the event was really scary for my parents. Obviously, I didn't know the whole situation, and how close it was, until I was much older. While most people are scared of clowns, after that, I actually had the opposite idea of them. They were my heroes. That one clown had saved me, and I cannot thank him enough for listening to me and believing me. I was glad that I'd had that idea at that age, that I hadn't just completely frozen, and I thank that man for quite possibly saving my life. I have a short but honestly terrifying story that happened to me about 15 years ago on Halloween night. For some background, I live in a fairly decent little town outside of a major city. It's more of a growing suburb than anything, and it's mostly pretty quiet. At the time of this story, I was 28, and my son was just turning 8, so he was at that age where he still needed my help with a lot of things, but he was wanting to be more independent, so I was doing my best not to smother him. I was still doing what I could to make sure he was doing things right, and didn't need my help. I'd raised him myself without his father, so it was tough, but it's part of being a parent. On this particular Halloween, he wanted to go trick-or-treating, and I, of course, was going to go with him. But he also didn't want me hovering over him. He was, in his words, big enough to go to the door alone and knock. It was also rather cold and wet that year, so he and I made a compromise. I would drive the car to each road and direct him which houses to go to, and would watch him from the car, and he would get to do it all himself unless he physically needed help. I would drive him to each street, and we would do this until he got tired, or it got too late. For most of the night, things went smoothly. He was pretty happy to be walking between the houses on his own. I was happy that I was able to watch him and not upset him. He would go to the houses, say trick or treat, and if they would ask where his parents were, he would tell them that his mom was watching him from the car because he didn't need help. Most of the older people would laugh at his comments. Some of the younger ones, I think, had an issue with it, but we were both happy, so whatever. Every time he would get in the car, he would show me his bag and what they had given him, and would tell me that he was having a lot of fun. So, it was a great night. However, on one street, things went from really fun to actually quite terrifying. We'd pulled up on the street and everything looked normal. A few of the houses were dark and there weren't many trick-or-treaters, but I figured that that was more because of the time than anything. It was getting late. There were a few houses with their lights on, so I told him to go to the 3 houses and to come back to the car, and then we would make a game plan from there. He said okay, hopped out of the car, and started to go to the first house. As soon as I watched him go to the first house and then make his way to the second, I felt something cold hit the side of my head. I started to look over toward whatever it was, but it clicked pretty fast. There was a guy dressed in all black, holding a gun to the side of my head, and he very quickly told me to get out of the car and not make a scene. I was obviously panicking. My son was at one of the houses and he was going to come back to the car soon, so I wasn't going to do anything to make this guy want to pull the trigger. I told him okay, and that I would do whatever he was asking, and I opened the door and stepped out. As soon as my feet hit the pavement, he shoved me off to the side and jumped into the car, and then took off down the road going way too fast. Thankfully, there weren't many people on this road at the time because, with how fast he was going, he would not have been able to stop if a child had walked out into the street. I stood up, still freaking out, and I immediately ran over to the house that my son was at. He was still getting candy from them when I walked up, and the old man at the door looked up and smiled, asking if I was his mother. I said that I was, and I think that he realized something was wrong right away, based on my tone. I started to tell him what had just happened, and as soon as I said it, I pretty much started bawling. He told me to come inside, so the 2 of us stepped in, and he said that he would call the police. His wife came over and asked what had happened, and he told her, and honestly, the whole thing was such a terrifying and embarrassing mess. Here I was, with my 8-year-old son, in some random old couple's house, crying my eyes out because some rando had just carjacked me. Of course, my brain was sifting through those anxious thoughts about how it would have gone if my son was in the car at the time, how it would have traumatized him, all that. They called the cops, and the old lady got some water for myself and my son, and we sat there while we held a pretty nice conversation with them. She actually gave him the rest of the candy, and they shut off their light, and then she showed him how to crochet or knit. I don't really remember. He was entertained, and thankfully didn't really understand the whole situation beyond something bad had happened. When the cops got there, I gave them all the information that I had on the guy, but I didn't really see his face. I did see the logo on his jacket, and I gave them all the information on my car, of course. After they left, the old man said that he would take the two of us home. Thankfully, I had a spare key hidden in the front yard, so we could at least get into the house. The whole time, I was apologizing to the man for the inconvenience, and he just told me that he was happy to help, and was sorry that the whole thing had happened. After we got home, my son wanted to stay up and watch some scary movies, and as much as I wanted to tell him no because it was late, I just said screw it and let him enjoy the night. I ended up falling asleep on the couch while he was watching some creepy movie, and the next morning when I woke up, he was passed out on the floor with candy wrappers everywhere. I ended up calling him out of school that next day, and I called out of work so that we could just hang out together at the house, since I knew he wasn't going to be up to going to school, and I wasn't really in the right mindset to go to work. To wrap this up, they did find my car after a few days, but they never found the guy. The car was abandoned on the side of the highway after he had blown a tire, and one of the wheels was pretty messed up. But, thankfully, somehow, there wasn't any damage that couldn't be repaired. It was expensive, sure, but thankfully my parents were able to help me. I can't imagine how stressful it would have been if they couldn't have. When he got a bit older, I did finally explain to him what actually happened, mostly because I've always tried to be open with him. He didn't really remember that night, so at least I know that he wasn't traumatized by the whole thing. For me, however, that was the most terrifying Halloween I had ever had, and it's probably the scariest thing to happen to me personally. We did go trick-or-treating for a couple of years after that, but we stuck to our block. So, to everyone out there, stay diligent, and make sure that you don't let anyone sneak up on you like I did. Halloween is supposed to be a fun night, so make sure that you're staying safe out there, so that everyone can enjoy the holidays' festivities. Hello. I would like to share an experience that my daughter actually had as a 7-year-old. I've been researching and watching a lot about past lives, thanks to her as well. And I'm learning a lot about it, too. This all started about 5 or 6 years ago. My daughter, Brooke, was home from school for a snow day, and I was quite frankly feeling pretty crummy. I'd been laying on the couch, watching TV, trying not to appear miserable on the outside, and Brooke was in her room playing. I could hear her TV and her talking as if she was playing with her toys. As I laid there just trying to relax, I started hearing some unusual sound effects, and phrases coming from her that I had never really heard before. She was making sounds like an airplane, as well as acting as if she was talking to someone. It wasn't alarming, but it still caught my attention, and being curious, I got up to check on her and see what she was doing. I approached the open door and watched as she was sitting at her desk, holding a piece of paper that she had drawn some kind of W shape on and cut out. She had asked to use the scissors earlier. As she held on to the paper, rocking it side to side, she also moved her hands back and forth as if she was pulling levers and pushing buttons. She also had on my husband's old broken headset. She's very creative and likes to play with things like that, so when he went to throw it away, she asked if she could have it. As she sat there wearing the headset, moving her arms around, and was speaking the whole time using phrases and jargon that I had never heard before. Roger, this is Mustang 12, engines humming smoothly, altitude 15,000 feet. I stood there dumbfounded, not having any clue where she would have picked any of this up. I had figured out that she was pretending to fly an airplane, but as to how she knew those terms was lost on me. Neither me nor my husband have watched anything about planes. I couldn't even think of anyone that she may have been around that could have watched or talked about planes either. She always talked like a normal 7-year-old would. She had a slight lisp at the time, but it wasn't really noticeable unless she got really excited about what she was talking about. But when I watched her, her voice was steady, monotone, and not a single slip in her speech. I had never seen this before, and I had no explanation for it. I stayed where I was, listening to her as she described landing the plane, and when it was stopped, she put her steering wheel down, took her headset off, and sighed. I didn't mean to startle her, but as she did that, I softly called out for her, making her jump. I cheerfully said, "What are you playing, Brooke?" "I was flying, Mommy. I was up in the sky in a big plane just like I used to." Obviously confused, I asked more questions. "What do you mean like you used to?" She had never been on a plane, and, in fact, I had only been on one before she was even born. My husband had been, due to his job, but she had only ever gone with me once to drop him off. Not even in the airport. When I used to fly planes, my favorite was a P-51 Mustang, and I was really, really good at it. She then went to her desk and started pointing at her wheel and random parts on her desk. She was naming off what I assume were different switches and gauges. I don't remember everything she said, but I wish I would have asked her about them again and written them all down. I just know that I stood there over her desk as she spoke in confidence about her plane, trying to grasp what I was listening to. After she finished her explanation, I asked her how she knew all of this, and that's what started me down this rabbit hole. She said, "I just know it. I learned it from school that grown-ups go to. I was very good at it, but the bad guys broke my plane and I couldn't stop it. But I want to fly planes again. It was a lot of fun." Granted, that was paraphrased a bit, but that was basically what she explained. I had heard of kids talking about a potential past life before, but never really thought more into it. Not expecting that to ever be something that I would experience. You know, the whole, well, that would never happen to me. But I began to ask Brooke more questions about what she was talking about, and how long she had remembered this. She said that she's remembered it for a long time, but couldn't really pinpoint it. She was still a child, though. I then asked her if she remembered anything else other than airplanes. She sat on her bed, squeezing her eyes closed, and smiling, and then she said the name. Martha. "I remember Martha. She was very pretty like you, Mommy. And I loved her. I'm sad that I can't see her anymore." She looked a little sad when she said this, even though she was smiling, but she said it with such conviction. How could I not believe her? We also don't have anyone in our family that I could think of named Martha. I even asked my husband and my mom if they knew of anyone, and they couldn't recall anyone either. Still feeling a bit surprised by this new information, I brought her into the kitchen to have lunch. The rest of the day continued on as normal, but I couldn't wait to tell my husband when he got home. When he did, and I explained everything to him, I could tell by the look on his face that he was a bit skeptical about it. He tried to reason it just like I did. She must have heard about planes or something and repeated it, but I explained to him how detailed she was. There was no way she could have heard this somewhere and memorized it to that extent. She gets her favorite SpongeBob quotes wrong sometimes, and she's obsessed with that show. My husband started coming around to the idea and was even more convinced when he heard her talking about it in front of him. She even mentioned how her name used to be Peter, and that she wanted to marry Martha when she came back from her last trip, but that's when the accident happened. She would bring it up on other occasions after that day, too. While we were outside playing in the snow, she crawled along the ground and shouted out other quotes that sounded like military terms. My husband had a hard time reasoning that one away. Both of our grandfathers and my grandmother were military when they were younger. That was how my grandparents had met. But they've all since passed, so she wouldn't have heard it from them. I had been casually looking into past life stuff at this point, but when she came up to me one day and asked me if I knew Martha or how to find her, I felt the urge to look more into this. She seemed so sincere, and she was so sad when she said that she wanted to make sure Martha was happy after she was gone. I considered looking into a therapist who specialized in past life regressions for children, but I couldn't find anyone in our area that would have been convenient, and I didn't want to put her through something that could potentially put her through trauma or give her PTSD, if she remembered something worse than flying a plane that crashed. What I did do was check out historical information at my local library in hopes to find closure for the person my daughter used to be. While my daughter was in school, I went to the library and started looking for anything I could about a pilot, possibly some kind of military pilot by the name of Peter. I was on the right path, but the info I was finding was limited. But then the librarian gave me a good suggestion. She mentioned a local historian that collected a lot of old war memorabilia and hosted many events about them. She suggested that I ask him about it, and gave me his contact info, so I did just that. I contacted the man and explained what little info I had, but just kind of explained that I was looking to expand a family tree. To my surprise, he was actually able to find something in a newspaper similar to an obituary, but more of a mass one for those enlisted that may have passed or were missing. There was a Peter listed as having passed away after a plane accident. The man then helped me find more info on this Peter, and we found another article with a picture of Peter, and, you guessed it, his lovely Martha. They were at some kind of ball or dance. The names were printed under the photo. That solidified it in me. Everything Brooke had told me had to be true. We didn't know this Peter or Martha, but somehow Brooke did. This man made a copy of the picture for me, and I took it home with me. When Brooke came home from school, I showed her the picture and asked her if she knew who it was, folding over the bottom so she couldn't see the names. She let out a huge gasp, and explained that it was her and Martha at some kind of serviceman's ball. I forget what she called it off the top of my head. She hugged me and thanked me for finding it, but when I asked her if she wanted to keep the picture, she said no. She said that she had really just wanted to see her one more time. I didn't ask her about her past life and memories after that. If she brought it up, then we would talk about it. But otherwise, I left it alone. And I think that's exactly what was supposed to happen. Over time, I noticed that she didn't talk about it as much, nor did she play the airplane game like she used to. I thought about this at one point and asked her about it, and she seemed completely confused. I mentioned Peter, and she laughed at me, saying, "No, Mommy, I'm Brooke." So, I'm pretty sure what I did helped Peter realize that he had passed. And, since I believed his story and acknowledged it, he was able to move on. It was an incredible experience, but I'm also thankful that it didn't stick around for her, in fear of it causing distress for her as she got older. Writing this out for you, though, has made me really consider putting together a short book, or a journal, maybe, of all the experiences that we had from this extraordinary phenomenon, just to have something to look back on, and maybe show Brooke when she's older. If I do, I'll be sure to share it with you too. And thank you for reading. I think this happened back around 2003 when we lived in Mississippi. I was about 14 at the time, and my little brother would have been around 9. We'd gone trick-or-treating for several years now, and last year we did a lot of it around our neighborhood by ourselves. I always loved going door to door, and it was even more fun when it was just the two of us. I felt like a grown-up being in charge of my little brother. I was also really looking forward to this year because my brother and I really enjoyed the movie Lilo and Stitch, and he wanted to dress up as Stitch. I was really close to my brother, so I decided I would go as Lilo and make us a cute matching pair, as well as an easy costume for me. While I do love Halloween and trick-or-treating, I had a sensory issue, and still do, so I don't like to wear a lot of things or layers at once. I already had long dark hair, so I didn't even really need a wig. Just a cute little red dress, really. The problem I'd had with this year, though, was what I was hearing on the news. There had been a report of at least a couple of kids that had gone missing that were close to my age. I wasn't good with locations, so I don't remember what city it was in exactly, but I do remember that it took place close to us. It honestly scared me, as I realized how many times I was alone. My parents often left me at home with and without my brother when they had to run to the store or something short like that. I had to walk down the street to go to the bus stop, and my parents wouldn't even be able to see me from the front door. I even rode my bike around the block or down to the little gas station by myself. Hearing the stories of the kids coming up missing alarmed me, but my parents didn't seem to think there was anything to worry about. When the news story came up, my mom would always make remarks about how stupid can you be, and would criticize the parents and blamed them for not watching their kids closely. However, she still told us to walk the block by ourselves, and when I asked if it was safe, she pretty much said, "Yeah, why wouldn't it be? Parents of the year, right?" And so we got all dressed up, and I made sure to bring my dad's shop flashlight, because it was made of some pretty hefty metal, and I stuffed it in my candy bag. I figured it would be good to have as both a light source and a possible weapon. I also made a mental note while we were out to keep a close eye on our surroundings. I was a little nervous since this whole night involved us going to strangers' houses alone, but because Halloween was also one of my favorite holidays, I was determined to remain vigilant, and also have a good time, so as to not worry or frighten my little brother. We made our way uphill first, as there were only 3 houses that way before we rounded the corner. After the turn, there was an empty house, because I remembered them recently renovating it. And then the road curved into a cul-de-sac that has 4 houses on it. We went to each one of those, and between just those few houses that we had gone to so far, our bags were already feeling pretty full. Between our candy load and how excited my brother was, I was starting to loosen up a bit and have more fun with it. We left the dead end and continued down the road, making our way to a house that had really gone all out. The whole yard was covered in creepy decorations, from a gory graveyard, moving ghosts in the tree, and they even made a path that you had to walk through to get to the door. One guy was even in a Grim Reaper costume, standing still until you walked by, and then he would scare you. I was surprised that my brother wanted to go through it, and, in fact, he laughed after getting scared. When we got to the door, the older couple complimented our costumes, gave us a big handful of candy, and asked us a few questions. After chatting, we left through the other side of the yard, and then back through the front gate. As we walked a bit, my brother was getting excited about one of the little toys he noticed the last house had handed out, and he started digging into his bag while we walked. He was wanting to carry it with him, but I was trying to get him to stop until we got to the corner where there was better light. Unfortunately, the exact thing that I was wanting to avoid happened, when we nearly ran into someone in front of us. At first, I looked up to see this tall man wearing some kind of hooded poncho or something. When I think back to this event, I start to realize that I had no idea where this guy had come from. There was a small group of kids and adults ahead of us, but they had already moved on, and no one had walked by us since we left the house. I suppose he could have been behind us and gotten ahead when we stopped at the house, but I don't recall ever seeing someone ahead of us. Anyways, I gasped a bit as I stepped backwards and apologized to the man. His response to this was saying in a really creepy way, "Oh, it's alright, baby girl. Are you okay?" My parents don't even call me that, so it immediately made me feel weird. So I just said I was fine and grabbed my brother's hand and walked around him. I started feeling like I was being watched, so I looked back and saw the guy still standing there in the same spot, now facing towards us. I turned back around and tried to get my brother to speed up so that we could get to the next house. As we left the next one, that poncho guy was standing on the sidewalk right by the house. He was smiling and made a comment about our bags looking heavy, and asked if we needed help carrying them. Now, I wasn't very well-mannered when it came to being scared or people that made me uncomfortable, so I just said, "No," as firm and grown-up as I could, and again pulled my brother along. I was really starting to become more panicked at this point, wondering what this guy's true intentions were. Surely it wasn't a ruse to take our candy. He was an adult, or at least looked like it, so he could have just gotten some on his own. So, if not the candy, what else would he want with young kids like us? It started freaking me out more when I thought about the kids that had been kidnapped recently. Was this guy responsible for them? Was he trying to find a good opportunity to grab us too? I started looking around to see if there were any adults nearby, or even the group of children that I saw earlier, thinking we would at least be safer with them, but they were even gone. My last hope was Ms. Marcia's house. Marcia was an older lady that worked at the front desk of the office where my mom worked. She was very sweet, and she always gave my brother and I some kind of treat when we went there with my mom for any reason. She actually lived on the road parallel, or behind our home, basically, which was also the road that we were on. It was a few houses down after the corner, so I started telling my brother that we should go to her house first. He didn't seem to mind, possibly because he was reading the situation too, or he was just getting tired. As we passed that first house, I heard the familiar creepy voice say, "Hey, you missed one, didn't you?" Before I could say anything, though, my brother yelled out, "You're being weird!" So I again held his hand as we ran. I was scared that this guy could get mad at my brother's comment, although I was glad he said it, and possibly chase us, so I wanted to get there fast. We made it to her house, and I pushed my brother ahead of me as I grabbed his bag from him and he started knocking on the door. Thankfully, she was home and had a bowl of candy in her arms. I frantically asked her if we could come in as I looked behind me and didn't see the guy. She, of course, invited us in, shutting the door behind us and asking what was going on. I started explaining the situation to her, and she said that I did a very smart thing by trying to avoid him and going to her house immediately. She gave us both some water, and we watched TV while she went to call our mom. After a short time, there was a knock on the door. I was trying to keep calm, thinking it was Halloween after all, and was thinking it was probably just some kids. But when Marcia answered the door, it was the same guy. He tried giving her some story about us being his kids, and apologized for us running into her home. Marcia, knowing our parents of course, told him off, saying he needed to leave as the cops had already been called. I remember his face clearly at this point, trying to look past her at us, and I heard him say, "Oh, I must have the wrong house. Good night." And he walked away. She shut the door, but went and sat at the window, presumably watching where he went. It didn't take long for my parents to show up, and then the cops around the same time. We told them what had happened while we were out there, and described the guy to the best that we could since it was dark. I remember giving Marcia a big hug before we left, being incredibly thankful that she was there, as I would have been shy just asking some random person to come in their house. As far as I'm aware, the guy was never found, which is still terrifying, but sometimes I still wonder what his intentions were. And could it have been the same guy from the news? Also, we just went home that night from there, and my parents followed us in the car the following years. I guess at least they agreed to do that. This happened in the heart of fall, the season where nature begins to wither away as we all prepare for that cold grasp of winter. I'd always loved this time of the year. The cold breeze, the crunch of the leaves underfoot, and that anticipation of the holidays right around the corner. I believe it was in the year 2002 that this happened. It was during this time that I experienced something that sent shivers down my spine. Something that I still cannot personally explain 20-plus years later. I grew up in a very small town in Ohio, where everyone knew everyone. This may sound weird to some people, considering how everything seems so modernized nowadays, but my family owned, and still owns, a modest-sized apple orchard which was our livelihood. Every fall we would harvest the apples for sale, and a majority of the townsfolk would come by for the fresh produce. It was a tradition, as far back as my great-grandparents, according to my dad at least, and it was a sign that fall had truly arrived in our little slice of the world. That year, the harvest was a good one. The trees were covered with the red and gold apples, and we were thrilled. One evening, my dad asked me to grab a basket and to do a final check on the far end of the orchard to make sure that we hadn't missed any trees. I, of course, did what he asked. I grabbed a basket, and I headed out into the deepening afternoon sky. As I strolled through the rows of apple trees, I enjoyed the lovely atmosphere. The wind was blowing through the trees, causing that calming rustling sound to reverberate around me. And there were also a few birds chirping and randomly singing. As I reached the far end where the older trees stood, I felt an eerie calm. It was almost too quiet out there as far as I could tell. I made it a point to just quickly check the trees, because I was feeling rather anxious about being out there. I went from far left and started heading towards the right, checking for stragglers or anything missed previously. As I was picking a few of the apples that were still strung up, I heard something that sounded like a whisper. It was faint, seemingly carried by the autumn breeze. I looked around, thinking that it may have been my dad or my brother trying to mess with me, but I didn't see anyone or anything around. It was just me in the trees. I decided that I was just hearing things, and immediately went back to doing what I was doing. After a few moments, I heard it again, this time a bit more clear. I pulled away from the tree and walked around for a moment, trying to see if I could figure out what was making the noise, or more likely who. Curiosity got the better of me. I set the basket down, and I took a few steps out into the orchard and called out. "Hello?" I don't know what I was thinking or what I was going to do if there was someone out in the orchard. I wasn't exactly a large 11-year-old, but I was wanting to figure out what exactly was going on out there. I stood there for a few moments, waiting to hear anyone to call back. But I didn't. I shook my head and walked back to my basket, grabbing it so that I could finish up what I was doing and go back to the house. As soon as I grabbed the basket, I heard it again. But this time I could actually hear what it was saying. The whisper was deep and almost like a growl, but its message was the opposite of that aggressive manner in which it was said. I stood there and heard this voice say, "Help me." The problem was, this wasn't just a normal person out in the orchard asking for help. This sounded like some kind of demonic, raspy, and chilling voice as it called out to me. I'm not going to lie. Hearing those words in that tone was enough to bring me back down to earth, quicker than anything else ever has, and I panicked. I dropped my basket, and I ran back to the house as fast as I could. I burst through the back door, and I know for a fact that I was sobbing as I yelled for my dad. He ran down the stairs in a hurry, asking me what the hell was going on. I'm not sure what words actually got out of my mouth at that point, but I know that I told him that I'd heard somebody say something like "help me" out in the orchard. At least, I think I got that out of my mouth. My dad nodded, told me to stay there, grabbed his shotgun, and then ran out the back door in a sprint. I stood there in the kitchen, literally shaking, crying for God knows what reason. And I started to worry that whatever was out there might ambush my dad. But at the same time, I was thinking that he had his gun, and I know that he was one hell of a shot, so if anything happened, he would be okay. I was pretty clearly a confused mess, but again, I was 11, so I didn't exactly have a lot of life experience outside of helping on the farm in our small town. After 15 minutes, my dad came trudging back through the back door with a bit of an angry look on his face. I remember him walking in and saying, "Don't do that. It's not funny to joke around like that." I told him that I wasn't joking, that I heard someone say "help me" at the end of the orchard, that it actually happened. And he just shook his head, saying, "Well, if you really heard someone, they aren't there anymore, so nothing to worry about." He told me that I needed to finish picking on that tree that I was at, and that dinner would be ready in a few minutes. I just relented and walked back out into the orchard, which was now starting to get dark, to get my basket and get back to the house. I got back to the tree, grabbed a couple more of the straggling apples, and started walking back. As I turned to walk back, I swear that I heard that creepy voice again, once more saying, "Help me." But this time I just chose to ignore it. I made my way back to the house with my eyes closed and just thinking, "It's all in your head. Dad says there's nothing there." and that was it. Nothing more really happened, and after that, I did everything I possibly could to avoid that section of the orchard. To this day, I will not go back there, and when I get out to help my parents with their trees, I do so close to the house, at the younger front trees. I don't know what it was that was whispering to me. I don't know what it wanted from me, and I have no idea what its intentions were, but I know that it was there, and I know that it was very real. Okay, so this is a story about not only my past life, I guess, but also my best friends. People always joke around about us, not in a mean way really, but I just don't think they understand it. We don't really share our story with others too often because they don't seem to get it, but after hearing all of the stories that you've done previously, I feel like our story would fit here with you and your audience. And I would love to share it with more people that are open-minded, so here it is. It all began when my family relocated to a new city. We had one major move prior. We'd moved to a different state, and I remember feeling stressed about it. At the age of 8, not wanting to leave my room. I loved it, but when they said that I could choose the color of my new room, it made me feel better about it. Then, when I was 10 or 11, we moved again, but this time it was just to a different city but the same state. However, while I would be going to a whole new school, having to meet new friends and, once again, leave behind my awesome pink bedroom, I somehow felt better about it. I was actually excited about it, for no other real reason other than just moving. No one thought much of it at the time. Maybe my parents were relieved that I wasn't as difficult about it, who knows. So, I started at my new school, and yes, I was excited, but also still a bit nervous, and maybe even shy. However, I didn't get to really be the quiet, reclusive new kid because, as I walked into the room, there was a young girl standing in the back, like she was expecting me, and she was all smiles. Her name was Lily, and she immediately ran up to me and gave me a warm, huge hug. As she hugged me, she whispered to me, "I've been looking all over for you." And she pulled back, still wearing that same big smile. It was strange. She made me feel like I immediately belonged here, but also as if I've known her my whole life. I just accepted it for what it was and found my place at my desk, next to hers, per her request. From that day forward, our friendship and bond blossomed at an astonishing pace. We immediately became close friends, closer than any of my previous friendships that I've had. It was as though we were two pieces of the same puzzle, fitting together in everything that we did or said. Our interests aligned perfectly, our pet peeves matched, and it was uncanny how often we knew what the other was thinking, or how we could complete each other's thoughts and sentences as we got older. However, nobody else seemed to grasp our connection to one another, nor could they understand the depths of our friendship. It seemed to transcend a normal BFF situation. And while I could sense that it was a strong friendship, I didn't think of it as anything else. But for Lily, there was more to it. Over time, she would make comments like, "I'm so happy that you're finally here. I've been waiting forever for you to come back." And then the statement that really made me curious. "I'm so happy that we got to do this again." I used to just think that they were weird comments and never said anything about it, thinking it was just Lily. At this point, we were probably around 12. I know that I thought the comments were a little out there, but it was always something that I could shrug off. She was highly intelligent, but also had a quirky side to her, so I just thought it was her odd choice of words. But that last comment really made me question things, and since it got the best of me, I questioned her about those almost cryptic comments. She looked at me bewildered and asked, "You don't remember? You don't remember us before these bodies?" I was confused. What on earth did she mean by these bodies? I know that I had to have a weird look on my face, and I know that she could read it too. She looked surprised, and maybe even a bit disappointed as she said, "Oh, I thought you knew already." She asked me if I remembered my last life, the one where we grew up together. Again, I made a comment to her about not knowing what she was talking about, and was confused about the growing up part. We were still kids. We hadn't grown up yet. And I certainly hadn't known her the 12 years I'd been on this earth. I asked her what she meant, and after giving me another look of pity, she agreed to explain, but made me promise not to tell anyone as they wouldn't believe her. And I promised. She began to tell the story of two friends from a time long ago. She said those two girls were us. They did everything that they could together. They met in high school and had been inseparable since. They shopped together. They did chores together. They even went to each other's houses as adults just to talk and hang out. She described how they were both married, but while their husbands worked, they found time to be together to do whatever they wanted. Lily even stopped her story to say that we were living at the wrong time. She then explained how, even though they were just friends, it didn't stop people from gossiping and spreading rumors. Dangerous rumors for that time. The first time she explained this to me, that was pretty much where she left the story, telling me that the two of us once lived in a different life at a different time. I was still shocked and confused. At the time, I didn't even know of the phrase past lives, or what reincarnation was. However, at the same time, I believed her. I had no reason to. I still didn't even fully understand what she was talking about, but something was making sense in my head, or telling me that what she was saying was the truth. I told her that while I didn't fully understand the concept, I did believe her. So, after embracing what she explained as the truth, she became more open with me and told me even more stories of things that she remembered from the past. She said that while she had darker blonde hair and I had black hair in this life, it was the opposite. She said that she'd looked completely different, but said that she knew it was me because my green eyes looked exactly the same. She told me about different things that we liked to do, like gardening. We had started a garden at her home where we grew all kinds of different flowers and sold them as is or made oils and soaps with them. Her stories were always fun to listen to, as she made it seem so magical, and like we genuinely enjoyed our lives. But she never explained how we ended up in our current life. Once again, I asked her about it. I asked her why did we get a second life in the first place. She seemed hesitant to tell me, saying that it made her sad, but I barely understood this as is, so I wanted to know as much as possible. Reluctantly, she finally agreed to explain it. As mentioned, the rumors and gossip that revolved around us only got worse, to the point that it caused suspicion in my husband at the time. We'd gotten into an argument, he became violent, and I succumbed to my injuries. Lily said that no one would talk to her about it when she showed up at my home and saw the medics. When she finally found out what had happened, everyone blamed her, saying that she ruined mine and her own marriage. saying that she was heartbroken was an understatement. She was inconsolable for weeks and no one seemed to care. She said her husband didn't seem to have the same thoughts, but he also wasn't comforting her. It was at a time where men didn't normally show their feelings or their soft sides. She then told me how she couldn't get past that feeling of guilt and sorrow, and only saw one way out of it. She left a letter explaining everything, and then locked herself in the basement. But after she finished explaining the ending, she immediately perked back up and said that we shouldn't be sad because we were given a second chance. She said that she remembered her past life at a younger age, but when she talked about it or questioned it with her parents, they also had no clue what she was talking about, which made her think that no one would understand or remember, so she never talked about it again. That was until she had a dream where she was talking to someone who told her that I had come back too, and that we would meet again. That was what kept her going. Then, when I walked into class that day, she knew that it was me. It was kind of hard to take it all in at such a young age, but everything I said, that she told me about, and I believed her. The manner in which she explained it all and the emotions that she expressed as she told me everything was enough for me to know that it was the truth. I remember asking my parents about reincarnation around the same time, and the most I was really told was that it wasn't part of their religion, and they were very clear about that. I could tell that they didn't want to even entertain the idea, so when they asked me where I'd heard it from, I just told them that I saw it in a magazine. From then on, I never talked to anyone else about our past lives, except for Lily. Getting to the present time, we're both in our late 20s. We're both married to very loving and understanding husbands, and the four of us actually get along really well and spend a lot of time together. I actually have a little girl, and Lily is pregnant with her first as well. If I could remember my past life, I'm sure that our bond that we have now is just as strong as our previous one. Once again, we do a lot of the same things together. I also felt comfortable enough to explain our past lives to my husband, and while he didn't understand it at first, when Lily started explaining it more while her and her husband were over, I could see the look of intrigue as he listened. As mentioned, they have both been very understanding and open-minded. Overall, I could not ask for a better life. The family that I've created and chosen are truly the ones that have been there the most for me, and the most important. And for that, I am incredibly thankful for whatever it was that gave Lily and I a second chance. So, I never been the whole type to believe in ghost stories, or the things that go bump in the night spiel. I've always been a kind of skeptical person, not because I think people like to lie about their experiences or anything, but because I've never personally had an experience, and I'm very evidence-oriented. But when I had an experience back in autumn of 2016, I kind of changed from a skeptic to someone that more or less believes in the paranormal. I had just turned 17 about a week prior, which meant that this was in mid-October, as my birthday is October 9th. It had just started to hit that point where the autumn air had that crisp bite to it, and the trees were showing off their fall colors. My mom and I were living in a rental, an old colonial house that year. It was just the two of us, as my dad had left us back whenever I was a kid. That house had character, to put it kindly. Creaky floorboards and windows that would whistle and rattle if the wind got too strong. I always thought it was atmospheric, perfect for that spooky autumn vibe, hot chocolates, layered sweater, and watching old movies. I may have been a skeptic, but I still loved the season. That year was the first year where things would happen that would be weird and creepy. The events would start off small, mainly lights flickering. The lights in my bedroom would start to flicker at night. At first I blamed the wiring, the house was old as dirt after all. I told my mom and she mentioned that I needed to check the light and make sure the bulb was in the housing right and that nothing felt loose. I did, and nothing seemed off, so I just kind of decided to live with it. After a while, the flickering would be joined by the sounds of footsteps. They were soft but deliberate. As soon as the light would start flickering, I would start to hear these soft footsteps of someone tiptoeing down the hallway toward my bedroom, but then stopping as they got to my door. At first I thought it was my mom, but I would open the door and she wouldn't be anywhere near my room. In fact, she would be fast asleep. I could even hear her snoring in the room across the hallway. The peak of all the weirdness actually happened one night during dinner. I think it was about a week or so after the footsteps started. My mom and I were sitting at our dining room table. We would actually sit and have dinner together frequently and sit at that dining room table. It was a colder autumn night, so my mom had a little space heater in the dining room to keep us warm. We were sitting there eating dinner, having a nice chat about how the day had gone, when the lights to the dining room randomly flicked off. We went from laughing and having a nice little chat to sitting silently in a room that was lit only by the light orange glow of the space heater. We both kind of paused, and I'm guessing we were trying to figure out what had happened, and I mentioned that I would check the light switch. I got up, went over to the switch, and sure enough, it was turned off. It was weird, but whatever. I just turned it back on, and said that that was strange, and that was that. Or so we thought. About 3 or 4 minutes later, it happened again. We were back to talking, and then all of a sudden it was dark. I sighed, and I mentioned to my mom that it was kind of annoying, and then asked why it was happening as I turned the light back on. After I hit the switch and turned back to my mom, her face was white as a sheet. I asked if she was okay, but she just kind of stared at me for a moment and then said, "When the light shut off, I saw something." I asked what it was that she saw, confused and a bit concerned. My mom wasn't usually like that. She said, "It went dark, and then I saw eyes in the other room. Red eyes. Literally glowing red eyes." I chuckled slightly and mentioned that she probably just saw the reflection or glow of the heater, but she shook her head and said, "No, Q, I did not see a reflection. It was too high up, and these were bright red glowing eyes." I once again tried to explain it logically, saying that it was probably nothing, and that it was just a light in the other room, trying anything to dismiss this as anything unnatural. As soon as I said something like, "Mom, calm down. I'm sure you're just seeing things," there was this major crashing sound that came from the kitchen. We both jumped, scared as hell at whatever that was. I ran into the kitchen to see what had happened, and much to my surprise, the dish strainer was sitting on the ground, with the dishes all over the place, and several glasses and plates were shattered. I just stood there staring at the mess. My mom came in and quietly said, "What the hell is going on?" At this point, I went from not believing to being filled with adrenaline and thinking, "My God, this place is haunted by something malicious." There was no way for the dish strainer to just fall off the counter. It wasn't at the edge. It was at least 8 or so inches back and next to the sink. The only way for this to have fallen like that would have been for it to have been yanked or shoved off of the counter. We spent a long time cleaning up the shattered glass and ceramic. With how shattered things were, it was like everything was shoved off and then down to the ground, with immense force. And the whole time I was cleaning up, I was just sitting there shivering, trying to piece together the whole situation. But every time I would think about it, I would land on something paranormal. After that, the little things did not stop, but we never questioned it. It would click the lights off, open up cabinets randomly, but thankfully my mom said that she never saw the glowing red eyes again, and there was never anything as destructive as that moment. I honestly think it was my denial that had made this entity mad, though I don't know what had caused the activity in the first place. After that night, I didn't question any of it. I just accepted things that happened, undid whatever the spirits had done, like the lights and such, and would randomly acknowledge the spirit asking it to stop messing with me. To this day, my mom says that these things still happen. I obviously don't live there with her anymore, but she says that while it's still happening, there hasn't been anything else that was malicious. This happened in 2018, on Halloween night. I was taking my two kids out trick-or-treating, and it was going to be the first year that my youngest actually went with us. Before then, he just stayed with my mom while I took my oldest, but now at the ages of 6 and 4, they were both going, and they were both really excited about it. Since my youngest didn't really care what costume he was wearing as long as he got one, I decided to do the cheesy mom thing and get matching costumes. What I didn't expect was my oldest wanting to do it with us, so he went with Cat in the Hat, and my boys were Thing 1 and Thing 2. We were really cute, and my youngest seemed to love the idea of my hat and whiskers. We started at my mom's place so that she could see us and get pictures of us looking our best, and then we walked her neighborhood first. She lived in a nice area, and the majority of the people were retirees, so they loved seeing the kids and handing out lots of candy. We'd been doing well, and we were all in good spirits, my youngest not showing any signs of slowing down. He was always trying to be in front of us, and was adamant about trying to ring the doorbell before we got to it. This one particular house was no different. There were 2 carved pumpkins resting in the grass, lining the sidewalk, and the porch light was on. Our typical signs that we could try knocking. We approached the door, and after my youngest, Reuben, rang the bell, we stepped back and waited as they excitedly held out their bags. After the normal allotted time that you would wait, no one came to the door. Reuben was ready to press the button again, so I had to explain to him that if they didn't answer, you walked away. And this all took place probably within the span of just a few minutes, so after explaining this, I told them it was time to go and started ushering them to the gate. As we started walking out, I could hear a door being unlocked, like the loud clunking sound of a deadbolt, and turned around to see the door being opened. Reuben noticed too and immediately went back to the door, holding out his bag again. But the moment that the door creaked open, I was hit with a sight that would never leave my conscience. It was a frail-looking woman, and her appearance was nothing short of alarming. She had on this raggedy old tank top. You could tell it was once white, but was now a very off-white. There was a hole near the side and a dark brown or red-colored stain towards the unraveling hem. Her bottom attire looked just like a pair of men's boxers, also very dirty and old-looking. As bad as this sounds, her face just added to the unsettling feeling. Her eyes were sunken in, one of them was bloodshot, as if something had happened to her. but her eyes remained wide open and constantly moving like she was looking for something or someone. Her hair was a tangled mess, bunched up, resting on her shoulder like it was once in a bun. I felt an immediate wave of unease wash over me as I rested my hands on my kid's shoulder. She seemed to notice this, which made me instantly feel bad for reacting the way I did. Maybe she was just ill or something, and we disturbed her. I smiled politely at her as my kids said trick or treat and waited for candy. After staring at us, she looked over us, scanning the area as if she was trying to find someone. She stepped back into her home and grabbed something from behind the door and returned with a transparent bowl full of loose M&Ms. She then took handfuls of them and threw them in my kids' bags. I don't mean packages of them either. I mean opened, poured into a bowl that you would keep and eat yourself, but just handfuls of it, now just tossed into their bags. I was already distracted enough by that and her appearance, so I was taken aback when she started talking to me. But not because she was striking up a friendly conversation and commenting on our costumes. It was pleading. "Help me," she said in a trembling whisper. I didn't know how to respond or if I'd even heard her correctly, so I just responded with pardon me? She persisted, now whispering a bit louder as her eyes remained wide open and staring at me. "Help me, please. You won't let me leave. Help me." I was still in shock, racing to comprehend the situation. Was this real? Did she really need help, or was this some kind of ruse? Or maybe even a really bad prank? If so, I couldn't fathom anyone finding this kind of scare amusing. I had young children with me, and the way that Ruben backed up into me told me that he was already feeling uncomfortable. I tried to remain calm and speak in a controlled tone, to not give away that I was either falling for a prank or scared. "Are you okay? I can call the cops for you." Her eyes softened some, and she let out what I can only describe as a small whimper. She looked so sad as she slowly shut the door in our faces. I never saw or heard another person, even though she mentioned a he. But either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. People wouldn't joke about something like that, right? Or at least wouldn't end the interaction like that. So, with this heavy on my mind, I took my kids out of the yard, walked down to the front of the next house, and called the police. I tried to keep my kids distracted by asking them questions and checking out all the goods they've gotten while I waited for the police. When they did arrive, I explained everything that I saw and heard, and they asked if I would stand by to confirm who came to the door, and I agreed. We stood behind one of the cop cars as they approached the door and knocked, but when she answered, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was the same woman that I had just met less than 20 minutes ago, but she looked completely different. Her hair was now pinned back, but the ends were blunt, like it was obviously just cut. She was wearing a long black dress and appeared to have applied makeup. I couldn't see the dark circles around her eyes, and she was obviously wearing dark lipstick. She stood there smiling at the police officers, talking with her hands and even laughing. My heart sank as I watched her offer the officers a candy bar, not some loose M&Ms from a bowl. After a few minutes, the officers returned to us, explaining that the woman did confirm the incident was a prank. She claimed to live alone and assured them that she was perfectly fine. I couldn't help but feel skeptical. If it was all a prank, why had she changed her clothes? Why not simply say, yeah, it was a joke? Especially to the person you're trying to prank. The same person that said they were going to call the police. And there's no way that she didn't see me standing there. why not apologize to me? And even more perplexing, why would she cut her hair? It's not something you can undo, so what was the purpose of it? I shared my doubts with the officers, trying to emphasize the gravity of the situation and how sincere her pleas were. What if she was in genuine danger? What if she had to change because the person she spoke of noticed her? However, they told me they would look further into it, assuring me that they would reach out if they needed further information. We finished our night shortly after that, the exhaustion catching up to us after that whole event. And as days turned into weeks, I never got a call or update from the police. My mom said that she never even heard or saw anything in the week or two that followed. She said she even drove by the house a few times and there was never any motion going on out there. I want to believe that it was a prank, but the fact that she's never even seen outside only cements my thoughts that someone doesn't want her to be seen. I've even disturbingly looked over obituaries and missing person reports to see if maybe I could spot her, but there was nothing. Of course, we have gone trick-or-treating since that year, including that same neighborhood. My mother still lives in the same place. However, since then, the porch light has been off, so we haven't even tried approaching the door. I just can't help but think about it. I often think about her, especially as Halloween approaches. I hope that it was just a terrible prank, and that she was terrible at it, but I still fear that something sinister was happening, and her one chance that she took failed, and that she still could be in trouble. Growing up in the 90s, trick-or-treating was a sacred ritual for us kids in our small suburban town. We didn't have urban legends about ghosts, goblins, or monsters. We were the type that would listen to the whispers about which houses in the area were giving out king-sized candy bars. There was one house at the end of the street that Tommy claimed was haunted by demons, a claim that he made without evidence or even reason. Not really relevant, but it does tell you the kind of kids that we were. Back in '97 was the year that this happened, and this was a Halloween that was more than terrifying for me and my group of friends. That year was a cold year for trick-or-treating. It was a chilly evening with a slight mist that was threatening our night with rain, and the wind was starting to act like we were going to get storms. We were quickly marching house to house with our pillowcases. They were starting to get kind of heavy. Our pack was 4 kids. Tommy, as I mentioned, Lily and her younger brother, Jordan, and myself. The 3 of us were 12, and Jordan was 9 years old. And with how small our town was, we were pretty much told to just walk the few neighborhoods and get the candy and get back to the house. We were not supervised. None of the kids in town really were. We'd been through most of the normal route and decided that we were going to head toward a neighborhood that was a bit out of the way, a neighborhood that we normally didn't go through and weren't supposed to go through. This was a bit of a different area of our small town. The houses were a bit further apart, and there were a lot more trees that lined the properties. In my mind, that meant that they were likely to give away more candy because there were fewer people, right? It made sense at the time, to me at least. We went to a couple of the first few houses and had decent hauls. Nothing crazy, but we were not willing to give up. We kept on down the road until we got to a house that caused us to hesitate. This house was something else entirely. Old, slightly falling apart, and the entire yard was littered with animal statues. When I say it was littered, I mean there were no more than 2 or 3 feet of the yard that did not have a statue in it. Owls, cats, dogs, lions, birds, gnomes, just a bunch of random and slightly creepy statues in all directions, all turned to face the walkway from the street to the door. We all just stood there looking at the house, waiting for anyone to go up to the house. Basically, no one in our group moved until someone else was going to move. Suddenly, Tommy said something stupid like, "I think that it's a witch that lives there." I immediately scoffed when he said that. Like, full on, pfft. I told him that that was dumb, because there was no such thing as witches, and that it was probably just some old lady that liked animals a lot. I rolled my eyes and decided that I would be the one to go knock on the door and get the candy, and that my lame friends could stay behind. I stepped down the walkway toward the door, and I will mention that, as I was walking toward the door, it felt a bit oppressive. I felt the eyes of all those statues on me. It felt like they were all staring at me with malicious intent, and were going to jump at literally any moment. Of course, none of them did, but it was the feeling that seemed to overwhelm me. I got to the door and I knocked, since it didn't look like there was a doorbell. I really didn't even know if anyone was going to answer. But after about 2 minutes, there was a loud creaking sound that started in front of me. The door slowly opened in a manner that can only be described as unsettling. And on the other side of the door was an older woman. I won't get insulting with my description. I will just say that she looked a bit ghastly. She was very pale and had large eyes that seemed too big for her skull, and was dressed in an old nightgown. As soon as she saw me, she shifted to a large smile and looked excited. "Ah, a trick-or-treater! How delightful!" And she just sort of stood there for a moment as we stared at each other awkwardly. I was a bit caught off guard by her sudden excitement, considering the eerie vibe of the house. I tried to maintain my composure and broke the silence by saying, trick or treat? She smiled again and commented, "You're the first person to come to the house tonight. I haven't had any other kids come up and get their treats." I again just stood there like, "Okay, that's cool. Can I get my candy, please?" Obviously, I didn't say that. I just grinned and nodded slightly in agreement. She looked over to my group of friends that were standing at the end of her walking path, and then back to me and laughed. "Oh, I see you're the brave one, huh?" I once again nodded and just said, "Yeah, I guess." Then, it got creepy. She stepped forward slightly and said, "Why don't you come inside? I have some special treats just in the kitchen." Despite my initial bravado about approaching the house, I was starting to regret my decision, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Oh, no, thank you, ma'am. I think I should get going. Sorry." But as I said that, her hand shot out and she gripped my wrist like a vice grip. "No, no, no. It's cold out here. Come inside and warm up." I felt as she started to pull me towards the house with what almost felt like inhuman strength. I tried to pull my arm away from her and was screaming help. I felt so small in that moment, lost in this creepy moment with this old woman trying to drag me into her house. At this point, Jordan, Lily's younger brother, became the brave one of the group. He started shouting, "Hey, leave him alone!" followed by the sound of candy smacking into the side of the house and the porch. The distraction was enough for her to briefly loosen her grip, and I was able to pull away. I turned and bolted, sprinting back towards my friends. As we took off down the road, we could hear this old woman laughing like a maniac and saying that she would find us. We didn't stop running for several blocks. Our breathing was ragged and we were all running on pure adrenaline. As soon as we stopped, Tommy looked at me with a pale face. Dude, I was just joking about there being a witch living there. I didn't think she'd actually try to drag you into the house. When he said this, we all kind of chuckled, like, yeah, good call on that one, Tommy. Once we all caught our breaths, we decided to just head back home, that we'd gotten enough candy and that the excitement of the night was more than enough for the whole year. When we got back to Tommy's house, we sorted through our candy, did some trades before we all went our separate ways to get home. We never told our parents, and I think that was because we knew that we would get in trouble for going that far from home, so we just kept it as a lesson amongst our group. That was the last year that we all went trick-or-treating, too. When we hit our teen years, it just didn't seem as interesting. Obviously, Jordan had a couple of years left before he was done, but he just went with his dad instead of going with Lily. About a year or so later, that house was torn down, and all the statues disappeared. I would guess that the creepy old woman passed away at some point, or maybe she moved away. Be aware, 2020 opened up some schooling possibilities, and I think both my kids and I loved it. I was already working remotely, but now my kids were home with me, and we always made the most of it. We all got set up at our dining room table, and I even brought my laptop in there to work with them. We got very creative with our activities as a family, and even our meals. I feel like I got to learn more about my kids in that time and became even closer to them, and I was thankful for that. The story is related to one of those moments. While we were all working at the table, my 9-year-old, Allie, became frustrated with her work, so I stopped to help her. My 5-year-old, Jaden, has a late birthday. It's in October, so he wouldn't start kindergarten until the following year. However, he loved being a part of this, and making him sit it out would just be mean, so I got a few workbooks for him online that he could work on with us, and he was satisfied with that. Every day he would come to the table with his cute little play computer, some books and crayons, and it was always adorable. One of the pages in his workbook was a section for him to color in different people and different occupations, such as a doctor, a police officer, a fireman, etc. He was talking about everything he was coloring, but when he came across the fireman, he seemed to pause, staring at it, before he finally started coloring again. I just thought that he was trying to decide how to color it, or something like that. I knew that he couldn't read it so well, so I knew that he wasn't reading the page, but it was pretty obviously a fireman. He had on the uniform, the front of the truck was behind him, and he was holding the long hose. Jaden also loved fire trucks. So when he started coloring, I made a comment about it, asking what color he was going to make the dog sitting next to the man. He told me that he was going to make it look like our current dog, Sparky, and continued coloring. I smiled and let him do as he was doing as I did my own work. Shortly after, he then looked at me and asked, "Do you remember when I was big?" I looked at him smiling and said, "Oh, you're a big boy now." He rolled his eyes and said, "No, when I was big like you, a grown-up." A little confused, I told him, "Well, you aren't a grown-up yet, hun, but you will be. Just don't grow up too fast on me." He held out his arms on the table like he was exasperated and explained, "No, I used to be big, but then my bedroom was on fire and I got really hot, and the fireman helped me get out, but it was too hard to breathe and I got too tired. It wasn't his fault, but that's why I want to be a fireman. I want to help people too." My first thought was, what the heck did my kid watch recently? My oldest, Spencer, was looking back and forth between me and Jaden, obviously just as confused as I was. I asked Jaden why he would say all that, and he had the most serious look that a 5-year-old could have, and said that he didn't know, but he could remember it. Spencer waved his arms in the air and said, "Ooh, he was reincarnated," then started laughing. I gave him the mom look. If you're a parent, you know what I'm talking about. Once he lowered his arms, Jaden asked what that meant, but I told him it wasn't important and to continue working, which he did. I was confused by this conversation. I guess reincarnation was a possible explanation, but I was a skeptic, to be honest. I told my husband about it when he returned home, and when we put Jaden to bed that night, we asked him about it again. Jaden explained the exact same thing. He explained how he was an adult, how he'd gone to bed, and woke up feeling really hot. He said that he couldn't touch the doorknob because it hurt him. He then told me what the fireman looked like, and sadly explained how he got too tired by the time he was out, so he went to sleep. But that he couldn't remember anything after that. My husband asked him out loud where he had heard that from, and he said, "From my head. I remember it." We just left that alone and went to bed, talking about it in our own room. At first, we both kind of thought that it was creepy, but also assumed that he must have seen it somewhere. There was no other explanation for this. Nothing, at least, that made sense. I don't know if it was because we showed interest in his stories or what, but Jaden started talking about the past life more. He was brushing his teeth and started playing with his hair, and I asked what he was doing. He said that his hair used to be really dark, like Iron Man's, and he asked me why he didn't have a beard like he used to. All of my kids have reddish-orange hair, never dark hair. Neither did my husband and I, so I told him that he didn't have dark hair, and that he would get a beard when he got older. Again, becoming annoyed by me, he turned to me, hands out, and slowly said, "When I was a grown-up." I just apologized and told him I was having trouble understanding. He told me that it was okay, and he gave the best explanation that a 5-year-old could, about, you guessed it, a reincarnation. He mentioned how he felt tired after the fire, and that all he could see was dark. He said that he waited there until he heard someone calling his name, and then got mad because he couldn't remember his name. And then someone told him his new name was Jaden. The next thing he remembered after that was a bright light, and being really cold. Then he said that he was here. It was such a strange thing to listen to, considering how consistent he was with his story. The details all remained the same. Jaden mentioned his other life on multiple occasions, and it was probably consistent throughout the rest of the year. But then, one night while everyone was asleep, I heard a soft, "Mommy," being whispered to me. I rolled over and opened my eyes to see Jaden just standing there over me, holding his little light-up dinosaur. I asked him if he was okay, because it was unusual for him to come to our room. My other two were very attached, but Jaden had always been pretty independent. As soon as we got him his own big kid bed, he stayed in his room every night with no issues. He looked at me smiling and simply said, "I remember now. My name? It was Arthur. But I'm happy here as Jaden. Thank you for being my mom." He then patted me on the head and walked back out of the room. I got up to go check on him being half awake. I had no idea what he was going on about. I got to his room to see him lay back down in his bed, tell me goodnight, and then he fell asleep. The next morning, I asked him about it while we ate breakfast, and he basically had no recollection of this. Spencer suggested that maybe he was sleepwalking, but his choice of words was what stood out to me. However, no matter how many times I asked Jaden about it or mentioned the other person in the fire, he looked at me confused. He said that his name was Jaden, and that it always had been. So, I guess that's over. His memory or vision lasted a little under a year, and after remembering his name, it was done. Since then, it has not been brought up again by him, but the rest of us remember what he said and described. But now I find myself conflicted on what exactly it was that my kid experienced. This happened back whenever I was 7 years old, and at the time it was the creepiest thing that I had ever experienced. I admit that it was kind of a nothing really happened event, and of course I didn't have much experience being 7 years old, and the scarier things have happened further into my life, but this was seriously terrifying at the time. It was Halloween, which is obvious by the fact that we were trick-or-treating at the time. We had a local park that was owned by a church, and they liked to do this big Halloween event that was kind of like a trunk-or-treat thing, but it was almost like a little Halloween carnival. My dad agreed to take myself and my little sister, and I was over the moon. I was a little girl that loved everything spooky, and I was finally going to what I thought was going to be the pinnacle of all the Halloween events, even though it was watered down and hosted by a church. I was obviously amped, and I thought it was going to be an amazing evening. My dad was busy keeping an eye on my little sister, so at one point I had kind of wandered off to check out this haunted maze that they'd set up. I thought that I was old enough to handle it. I yelled to my dad that I was going to go to the maze, and ignored him when he told me to wait for him and Lacey, my sister, who was 3 at the time. I was so engrossed that I didn't think anything of it, and just assumed that he was right behind me. I entered into the maze and made quick work of it. It was creepy, but it was super quick to get through. I pop out the other side, and I'm amped because they gave me this caramel apple as a prize for getting through. I immediately unwrapped it and bit into it, and then looked around for my dad and sister, only to not see either of them. The crowd looked a bit thinner than I remembered, but neither of them were there. I walked around the side of the maze and out to the front, the main area of the festival, thinking that they would be there waiting, but still did not see them. I was just kind of standing there like a lost puppy, looking around, thinking, where did they go? After a few moments, I walked over towards the entrance, thinking that if they were looking for me, they would have me come to the front, right? They would go somewhere that I could be seen and was a common checkpoint. After a few moments of standing at the front, I saw this person wearing a mask standing off to the side, just kind of staring at me. He was wearing one of those exaggerated old person face masks, the kind that are really wrinkly and flabby. At first, I just saw him standing there and didn't think anything of it. Just a person standing off to the side in a creepy mask at a Halloween carnival. After about 2 or 3 minutes, I noticed that he hadn't turned away from me or walked anywhere else, and I was hitting a point of getting a bit worried by it, because, again, it was creepy. I knew that something was off at that point. My heart was starting to speed up, and I could feel myself starting to cry. Right about then is when this creepy man in the mask started to walk toward me, and I choked as I just thought, this guy is going to kill me. Again, I was like 7, so that was just a random idea implanted in my little brain by the horror movies I've seen. I just stood there watching this creepy person walking toward me. And as he did, I watched as he reached his hand into his pocket and pulled out what looked like a dog leash or a leather rope of some sort. I was starting to shake as he slowly crept toward me with this rope in his hand. Thankfully, at the point where he hit the midway point between us, my dad walked up to me and asked where I'd been. I looked up at him with teary eyes and I couldn't speak. I just burst into tears at that point. He picked me up and told me that it would be okay, but that I needed to stay by him for the rest of the night so that he didn't lose me again. I remember looking back to see if I could find the creepy man, but he was gone. What wasn't gone, though, was his mask. It was on the ground, as if he had taken it off and tossed it before walking away. I have literally no idea what his intentions were. The rope or leash or whatever it was enough to scare the hell out of 7-year-old me, but the fact that he left the mask tells me, at least now, that he didn't want me to be able to point him out to my dad. I absolutely assumed that this man had ill intent, but thankfully my dad showed up just in time. Like I mentioned, I know that this was kind of a nothing really happened story, but it was still terrifying to me at the time. I saw a few people on here talking about bad experiences they had as kids during Halloween, and it brought back a pretty terrible memory that I'd pushed to the back of my mind. This happened when I was around 11 years old. Like any kid, I was excited for Halloween. I don't know about other places, but my school let you come in the day of Halloween in full costume. And then at the end of the day, the final class was changed out for a mini trunk-or-treat style event for us. After school, we'd go home and hang out until it was around 7 or 8 p.m., and then head out for trick-or-treating. I remember being especially excited this year because my mom finally managed to find a Harry Potter costume that wasn't used or old, and it also came with the Quidditch broom. I was also very obsessed with Harry Potter, so this was a huge thing for me at the time. We set out on the first round of houses, that being our neighbors, and since we all knew each other and hung out with the other families quite a lot, we always got first come, first serve, and they gave us the good stuff. Full-sized candy bars, Reese's, Hershey's, Snickers. It was a kid's dream. They only did it for the kids that they knew, and my mom told me it was because there was a chance other families started earlier, and we might miss out on some good candy later on, so they wanted to make sure we had something good by the end of the night. After we finished with the neighbors' houses, we stretched around the block and hit all of the neighboring streets. We landed on the final street for the night at about 10 p.m. I had to get a second bag just to fit the rest of the candy. Being an only child had its benefits. When we hit the final street, we noticed that all the lights in the houses were out, except for one. It was late, so it wasn't unusual for other families to get tired of the Halloween festivities and bow out later in the night, shutting all the lights off so no one else would show up. Most of the houses would put out the rest of the candy in a bowl or a chair so the kids could at least get something. We cleared out the bowls, and we hit the final house, the only one with the lights on. This one didn't just have lights. It had decorations blasting out of every side of the house. Giant blow-up ghosts and skeletons, orange and purple string lights, even a giant Jack Skellington on the roof towering over the rest of the property. My mom at this point was tired of getting out of the car, so she said that since it was the last house, and it was the most exciting to look at, that I could just go myself. We lived in a pretty pristine neighborhood, so neither of us were worried about something happening. I excitedly got out of the car and trotted through the glowing path to the front door. I wish I could describe how it felt. There was Halloween music blasting through speakers somewhere on the property, and the decorations enveloped you when you were dead center. It was a dream to a Halloween-obsessive kid such as myself. I reached the door and pushed the doorbell that looked like a severed eyeball. It rung throughout the house and made weird bell chimes akin to that of a dinner bell. After a few moments, the door swung open and a very tall, lanky man in a Jack Skellington costume greeted me with a freakishly toothy smile. "Hello there, little one, and happy Halloween," the man said. I smiled. I couldn't help myself. It was all so theatrical and unreal. "Trick or treat," I yelled out. I held out my bag and, waiting for the man to drop what I could only assume is the best candy haul I was going to get tonight, judging by the production budget of whatever was going on. "Right you are, Mr. Potter. Why don't you come inside and check out my full candy room?" I frowned. "My mom wouldn't like that. Sorry," I replied. "Oh, come on. It's Halloween. I have more candy in here than you have ever seen." I looked back at my mom's car and she was staring at the road. I could see her nodding off already. "All right, maybe just a peek, I guess," I said. "Excellent! Come get your treats." As soon as I entered the house, the door slammed behind me, and the man picked me up and ran upstairs with me over his shoulder. I instinctively screamed for help, the man covering my mouth just after I got the first few pleas out. The man then tossed me on the floor and closed the door, locking it behind him. I pounded on the door, begging and screaming to be let out. That's when I heard a loud commotion coming from somewhere in the house. Then a loud crash rang through the house, and then the tumbling, bumps, and sounds of fighting and thrashing. "Sam? Sam, where are you?" I heard my mom call out. "Mom, I'm upstairs. Help me, please." I screamed and pounded on the locked door. I heard loud footsteps coming up the stairs, followed by the doorknob jiggling. "Honey, you have to unlock the door," my mom yelled out. "I can't. It's locked from the other side." "Honey, I'm gonna need you to back up really far from the door, okay?" I got up and backed up from the door. Suddenly, loud footsteps pounded through the hallway on the other side, and something crashed into the door, sending it flying. "Oh, sweetie, are you hurt? Oh my God, baby," my mom cried as she picked me up and squeezed me. She carried me downstairs. The man was pinned on the ground by one of our neighbors, who happened to see the man lure me into the house just moments before as he was coming up to send his kids to the door. The guy was arrested, and the news stated that he was some kind of known sex offender or threat to the local neighborhoods. I'm so very thankful for my mom, and that my neighbor happened to be there at the right time. I have no idea what would have happened if he hadn't shown up. Thank you for all the awesome stories. It's relaxing to listen to while I drive. Hearing the past life stories on your channel made me want to share mine. For context, I've been fascinated with politics since I was in middle school. I'm a moderate right, I'm an artist, public speaker, and sometimes dabble in writing. And this will be important later. When I was 10, I had a dream that I was somebody else. Instead of a little girl, I was a young man. Everything was in black and white, and I walked up the steps at a library. I felt an overwhelming sense of fear and dread. Everybody hated me, but I knew that whoever the man was that I was supposed to be was a good person. It was in a city in the Midwest, and all I remember was that vision, but it always stuck with me. When I told my mom, she told me that it was probably a glimpse into my past life. I left it at that until years later when I was telling a friend about it. She, a medium, told me that it was without a doubt a look at my past life, and that it was at that age that people see visions of past lives. She offered to do a past life reading, and I accepted. During the reading, she revealed that in my past life I was a man named Tom, but went by Tommy. I grew up in a rural area as a happy kid, but moved to the city to pursue a career in politics as an adult. I want to say it was either Cincinnati or Chicago in the 1950s. I was walking up those steps to the library, as it was the release of my controversial book. I was a liberal Republican, which was unacceptable back then. She told me that I was working on an idea for a policy, and that I had to bend some rules to make it happen. Already a controversial figure, this made me appear unethical. I had more haters than followers, sadly. She told me that whatever I was working on, the idea was to bring people together, but it only made everybody hate me more. One fateful day, after a speech or event, there was a group of people who proceeded to crowd me. They tied me to a tree, and they beat the life out of me. I died. I was 27. And, at the time that I got this reading, I was 27. Interesting still, I had a supervisor at work who I had a deep connection with. It turned out that she was my assistant in this past life. The whole experience was surreal for me, as I learned that past lives often influence our skills and interests in our present lives. My trick-or-treating days are long over. I don't have any kids in the family who are still into it, and none of my friends have children who participate in it either. Sad, but that's how it is. So I make up for it by dressing up for Halloween and giving the neighborhood kids something to look forward to. It isn't uncommon for me to get 10 and sometimes 20 groups of kids, so I make sure that I'm well supplied. I am an introvert and I don't really talk to people, except on Halloween. It's how I was able to meet and befriend some of my neighbors over the years. I had just closed the door and heard a horde of costumed kids run off to the next house. I was about to sit down when I heard another knock. It was dark, but it certainly wasn't late. I groaned, getting up, and opened the door to see a woman with a stereotypical Karen getup. I couldn't tell if she was in a costume or if that's how she actually looked. She looked me up and down with the rudest look on her face. I was dressed up as a cheesy vampire that year. "Can I help you?" I asked her, and she gave me a smug smirk and then asked if I had given her child any mini bags of treats. It was possible. I asked what her child was dressed up as and if there were any problems. She told me that her child had a nut allergy and that my bag had caused him to get sick. Now, I try to be accommodating. I have separate mini bags with no nuts, vegan stuff, etc. to try to cater to everyone. Whenever the kids get their treat bags, I ask them if they have anything that I need to know, or diets to keep in mind. A lot of the local kids already know this. She looked like I had asked her an offensive question. I told her that a lot of trick-or-treaters came to my door and that I would offer alternatives. It was the child's or parents' job to tell me which ones they wanted. She said there had to be a reason why I was so happy to have kids over. I couldn't believe this. I told her to go ahead and just leave my property and not return. She started having an adult tantrum and left. I never saw her walking with any child. That woman even had the audacity to kick over one of my pumpkins on her way out. I was pretty upset about it. I didn't want to spoil it for the rest of the kids, though, and just kept doing my things. One of my neighbors came over with one of her older kids, and we had a bit of gossip. I asked her if she knew her, and apparently the woman had taken a photo of my house and posted it to the community Facebook, telling people that I was trying to poison people's kids. I don't use Facebook anymore. She told me not to worry and that there were a lot of comments defending me. I couldn't believe it. She told me that she'd come over to check on me after the school run to see how I was doing. I couldn't believe that this lady was so angry about this. I still don't know who her kid was. Nothing else happened with her until the next year's Halloween rolled around. I didn't want to let one person spoil things, so I got everything ready. Some of the mums mentioned it when they came around, and assured me that they didn't believe it. Come to find out, this crazy Karen lady was still posting about it on Facebook, and trying to spread awareness about me apparently poisoning children. I don't understand why she developed this vendetta against me. One of the comments I saw was interesting. Apparently none of her children had any allergies to anything. Some of the family and friends were commenting on the post, and even asked why the kids had been left out unsupervised. I didn't even recognize her kids as people who had come to my door. So, I guess that she just made it all up and decided to attack me? A friend told me that this was well beyond drama, and that I needed to consider taking her to court if it continued. I actually notified her, and she backed off, and apparently that was the end of it. Halloween trick-or-treating kept going as planned. I often wondered about it, though. What would have happened if I didn't really know anyone in the community, and I ended up being shunned because of that crazy lady? Anyway, that's my story. Trick-or-treating is still fun, and that's my one event that kind of hurt it for me. I'm not really sure if a Karen story is considered scary, though, but I hope you enjoyed it. I'm the second oldest of 5 kids, and while I didn't have a bad childhood, my parents were pretty strict, which I think was part of why I had a rebellious side. Those of you out there with similar parents should understand, or maybe you might remember being told you couldn't do something, or weren't allowed to go somewhere, and it only made you want to do it more, right? So, this happened to be the result of one of those nights for me. My friends and I loved trick-or-treating. It started out as a small competition between a few of us to see who could get the most candy, and then we wanted to see who could come up with the creepiest costume. We started putting together some of our own ideas, and my mom was at least willing to let me use any old clothes that my older brother couldn't wear anymore. In this particular year, I'd put together a kind of a mad scientist look. Now, I was in middle school, I believe 14 at the time, so we didn't have class parties, but a lot, if not most, of the kids still dressed up for Halloween. This year it happened to fall on a Friday, and I was pretty excited. I had dressed up, gotten everything ready to have a sugar-filled weekend, and then I was hit with the, "You're too old to trick-or-treat," by none other than my parents. And that's what I mean by they were strict. 2 years old, no more pacifier no matter what. 6 years old, no more nightlight. You should not be scared. I hated it. While my friends were going to be out collecting their own goods, they expected me to stay home and hand out candy with my older brother. But I had better plans. If they weren't going to let me go, then I would complain until they let me go to a friend's house instead. That worked. So from there, I would be able to hang out and trick-or-treat with some other friends that lived in the same area. I'm just gonna make up some names here. I stayed the night at Zach's house, and Brian and Jeff rode their bikes over so that we could all hang out. Zach's parents were super chill too. He was the oldest of 3, but his 2 younger siblings were too young to go out, so his parents didn't care if we went around the block together. They were pretty familiar with the neighborhood, and I even heard Zach and his parents talk about certain neighbors, so I think everyone assumed it was a safe place for us to walk around. And we weren't the only kids out there either. But that didn't mean that we were always successful. Towards the top or end of the street, we started running into some other kids that were trick-or-treating with their parents. When we saw other people, we were still polite. We let them go first and we watched what we said. We may have cursed and probably said some inappropriate things when there weren't any adults around. However, there were a few houses that, when we were up there with the other kids, they would actually look at us funny, and some even made those remarks. "Aren't you getting too old for this?" Usually, they would just give us a single piece of candy, unlike the younger kids around us. We actually had a few that just flat out refused to give us any candy. To say that we were pretty disappointed or annoyed was probably an understatement. We hadn't been doing anything wrong, and we were all even dressed up. I didn't understand why it was such a big deal. However, we still made up for it. Before I continue, I just want to say that I know what we did was still wrong. Even if those people chose not to give us candy, it was their choice. But at the time and age, all I saw was unfairness and I wanted revenge for it. So if a house denied us candy, we became a little mischievous. If there was a pumpkin or other decoration out front, we would smash it. We may take one of their fake bones sticking out of the ground or tear down their fake spider webs. We were always quick about it, not lingering very long in case they heard or saw us, but it was our way of saying, next time just give us the treat. So we planned on circling the block by going to the right and back down the street behind Zach's house and back around. There was one house on the other street that we stopped at, just like all the others. They didn't have any decorations out front, but they did have their porch light on, so we all agreed to try it anyways. We stepped back and talked while we waited for someone to answer the door. Shortly after, someone did. It was an older guy. He was shirtless and just wearing some shorts and slippers, with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. We all let out some kind of laugh, taking in his appearance, and greeted him with our normal chant. However, in a gruff and unfriendly tone, the man declared, "I don't give out candy to little brats like you," and waved his hand in a way that I can only describe as a shoo motion. Brian then asked why he even bothered answering the door, and the guy only laughed, flicked his cigarette onto the porch, and then slammed the door on us. The disappointment of not only being denied candy, but the irritation of being called little brats, mind you, this is the PG version of what he called us, had all of us pretty damn upset. Zach yelled out that he should turn his porch light off, and I remember yelling about how we should put a shirt on next time. We all started walking away from the house, making fun of the guy, when all of a sudden we heard the door being slammed open. We turned around to look just in time to see that same guy now pointing a gun at us. From that point on, it felt like it was all in slow motion. Before any of us could move, the guy fired. We all scattered, just trying to get out of his line of sight. I remember I ran to the right, the direction that we were already headed, and tried to hide behind a large tree in the neighbor's yard. From that angle, the side of the guy's house was blocking the view. Unless he left his yard and actively looked, he wouldn't find me. But my bigger concern was where my 3 friends were. Were they okay? Were they hurt? As I hid behind the tree, my heart racing, I saw the neighbor's door open and an older couple looked around. The woman spotted me quickly and pointed to me. The only thing on my mind at that point was getting help, and I needed an adult for that. I quickly yelled for them, saying the guy next door shot at us. The man walked towards me on the sidewalk and looked over at the other house, so I moved my head around the tree to look too. When I didn't see anyone, the man motioned for me to come over. I ran to them and started pleading with them that I needed to find my friends. The man told his wife to go back inside with me and call the cops. Shortly after, the man came inside pushing along Brian in front of him. He looked terrified, as he held up his bag with a big burn hole in it. We both sat silently in their living room as we waited for the cops to show up. When they arrived, we explained to them what had happened, and they confirmed they got a call from someone else that heard the shots. They said they were going to go talk to the guy and then asked about calling our parents. As scared as I was, I did not want to involve my parents, so I just told them that I was staying with Zach and gave directions to their home. They put me and Brian in the back of their car, and we watched as they finished speaking to the older couple and then the guy next door. Of course, he never answered. So, one cop stayed there while the other one took us back to Zach's place. Thankfully, Zach made it back to his place, and Jeff rode his bike home from there. When Zach got home, he told his parents, who had also called the cops, and my parents. They arrived shortly after. That was one of the longest nights ever, explaining what happened over and over and trying to convince my parents that we did nothing wrong. Apparently, the guy claimed that he did it just to scare us off and defend his property, even though we had actually done nothing to him nor his property. Yes, we may have smarted off to him, but it was because of the way he talked to us. But afterwards, we just left. And if he wasn't trying to shoot us, why did my friend end up with a bullet hole in his bag? That seemed pretty damn deliberate to me. The police told all of our parents that they would look into the matter further, but my parents basically said that his actions and how scared we were was punishment enough. They were not convinced that we were entirely innocent, but I still stand by this story to this day, now that I'm in my 30s. Nothing that we did that night warranted having a gun pointed at us. A bunch of 14-year-olds. So that ended up being the last night that I tried trick-or-treating. I even got nervous when my parents started taking my younger siblings out. Because, overall, who knows what his real goal was there? And what would he have done if he ended up hitting one of us? And was that normal for him? Now that I'm older, I wish that I could talk to that older couple and see what their experience was like living next to that psycho. Anyways, my point to this is that was a very traumatic experience for all of us. And I really wish people would just let all kids trick-or-treat and avoid anything like this happening to anyone.